In this video, I'd like to show you some examples of patterns that are used in functions and all over JavaScript frameworks. Now, we've already seen a couple of examples of functional patterns. For example, here we've created a function with some scope, and we did that by using an immediately executing function, which creates the scope, and a private variable with a value of 20 that's accessible inside of any functions that were created inside of this scope or this closure. Then over here, when we call this function, you can see the value is 20. In the rest of the video, I'm going to show you a couple more patterns, like using callbacks and iterator functions over lists. One of the most common patterns in JavaScript is to use callbacks. The idea of a callback is to create a function that can be called at a later time whenever the higher order function, or the function that we're passing it into, is ready to call it. So for example, I might create a function called whenDone, and inside of that, we'll just print out that I'm done. And so I'm encapsulating some logic here inside of this function, and I want to be able to call this entire thing at a later time. So I'll create another function that we'll pass this into. We'll just call this doWork. And doWork will take a callback. Sometimes you'll see it spelled out as callback, or sometimes the parameter will be called CB, or sometimes just func for function. We'll call it callback so that we're being explicit. And then inside of here, we'll do some work. And then when the work is complete, we'll go ahead and call the callback. So over in the browser, what I'll do is call doWork, and we'll pass in a function or a callback called whenDone. And when the doWork function is ready to call our callback, it will, and it prints out I'm done to the console. Now this is an example of a synchronous callback. And in other words, this callback is called at the same time in the same processing cycle that this function is called, and so it's not called at a later time. But typically when we pass in a callback like this, the callback doesn't get called until a later time. In other words, it's asynchronous. So for example, if you're making a jQuery call, an AJAX call to a site, and you get a result at some later time, that's asynchronous. Or if you're on Node.js and you're opening up a file and you get the result of the file at a later time, that's asynchronous. Another example of asynchronous is using the setTimeout and setInterval functions on the client. So we'll use that as an example here. Now, instead of calling this callback right away, what I'd like to do is call setTimeout. And I'll pass in the callback as a parameter. And then I'll say I want to call this about 3 seconds from now. Now this is an example of an asynchronous function, which means that this callback will get called at a later time, so it'll get put back on the event loop about 3 seconds later. And so that's more typical of a callback pattern, where we pass in this function and we want to call it at a later time once some asynchronous work has been done. So over in the console, I'll call doWork again, and I'll pass the whenDone callback function. But this time, it'll take about 3 seconds before the I'm done message gets printed to the console. And that's because the callback is getting called at a later time asynchronously using the setTimeout function. Another common pattern of functions is in iterating over a list of items in an array. So there's two things I'd like to show you. One is an iteration function, and the other is the idea of applying a function to multiple items in a list. Let's start off with iteration. I'm going to create a function called forEach that iterates over all items in a list and calls a callback for each item. This might be similar to something you'd find in the underscore library, or if you're using a modern JavaScript engine, it's actually attached to the array object automatically for us. But just to illustrate what's happening, we're going to create it ourselves. So the forEach function will take an array as a parameter, as the first parameter, and as a second, a callback. But instead of calling it a callback, in this case, we're going to just call it a function that we're going to apply over this list. Now, what we're going to do is create a for loop. And we'll iterate over each item in the list, and for each one, we're going to call this function with the list item, and then maybe the index of the item in the list. So this is an example of an iterator function, and the function callback that gets passed in is sometimes called an iterator. So we're going to pass in each item into this function as we loop through the array. So to show you how this works, let's create an array of items, and it'll just have the items 1, 2, and 3. And then I'll call for each and pass items as the first parameter, and then I'll pass a function or an iterator as the second. So this function will take the actual item as its first param and the index as its second. And then for each item, why don't we just print out the index and then the actual item itself. And over in the console, you can see the index of each item and then the string printed for each one. So this is an example of a more functional kind of way to iterate over a list of items with a function that gets called for each item in the list. Another example of applying a function over a list is a map function, which again you might be used to if you've been using the underscore library in Meteor. So a map function takes an array as the first parameter and again another function as a second. And it will iterate over all the items in a list. Now we could just reuse our for function above, but I'll just recreate it so it's perfectly clear what's happening. And instead of iterating over each item in the array, we're going to actually create a new array. And then for each item in the original array, call our callback function and assign it to a result. And then we'll take that result and push it onto the new array. And finally, when we're done, we'll return the new array. So this allows us to take an existing array and then iterate over it, applying some transform to each of the items, and then returning a new array with that transform. To try this out, we can call the map function and assign it to a new array. And we'll pass in the items, so the original items from up here on line 10. And for each one of the items, we're going to return a modified item, which will just be the item plus a new string here. And then over in the console, we can take a look at the new array. And notice that it's a new array with the original items, but with the new word appended to each item in the list. And so that's an example of taking a function and applying it to each item in the list to get some new result. In this video, I showed you a couple of functional patterns that you'll see again and again. We started off by reviewing how we can create private scope. And then I showed you how callbacks can be used both synchronously and asynchronously. And finally, I showed you some examples of iterating over a list of items and applying a callback function to each item in the list.